Hi friends, a very good afternoon to you. And in this video on communication matters a lot, we are going to discuss the very fundamental question, what is communication? What is communication? This is a question that kind of comes every time you are dealing with the subject, and it may be answered like communication is a fundamental human need, communication is the process with which we express ourselves, communication is a fundamental human faculty. Various answers and options can be used to answer this question, what is communication? But like I keep telling you in my previous videos, that communication, when you talk about communication, the one fundamental agreement, I would like to call it a fundamental agreement, that communication is a two-way process. Or for that means that no matter how you look at communication, how you define communication, everybody, almost every time, will definitely agree that communication is certainly a two-way process. In other words, it may also be understood that communication is a bipolar process. Almost similar are these two statements in the nature, that communication is a two-way process and that communication is a bipolar process. Now, what exactly do we understand by these two statements? It means, as we all know, that when we communicate, there has to be two entities, X and Y. So these X and Y who are communicating with each other, they are the two poles of communication. These two poles are bipolar. So communication is a bipolar process. It has a receiver Y and a sender X. So the sender X and the receiver Y are the two poles or the bipoles of the process of communication. Now, in this, between the two poles of the sender and the receiver, how does communication become, or why is it looked upon to be a two-way process? It is a two-way process because X sends a message to Y and Y gives back a feedback or a response. So basically what we see, there is a give and take in this process. So this give and take make communication a two-way process, and that it has the X and the Y, the sender and the receiver, makes it the bipolar process. So we have realized that communication is a bipolar process and it's a two-way process. However, if you really want to test why, in another manner, why communication is a two-way process, and a simple test would be, you take the word communication, right? This is a word which is a term. So you take this word and you take certain synonyms. What is a synonym? Synonym is a word which can replace the mother word in a simple sentence without changing the meaning of the sentence. For example, supposing you say, I am going home. Now this is a word under scrutiny. Can you, and this is a simple sentence, I am going home. Now supposing you want to change this word home. Can you change? Say for instance, you write the word den. You write the word shelter. You write the word house. You write the word cave. You write the word pad, bachelor's pad. So if you look at these words and you see the word home and then you replace the word home with say den, then how would it read? I am going to my den. I am going to my shelter. I am going to my house. I am going to my cave. The meaning of the sentence, I am going home, remains intact when you use these words. So these den, shelter, house and cave become the synonym of the word home. So synonym is a word which can replace the mother word in a simple sentence without really altering the meaning of the sentence. So the mother word and the synonyms will have similar, if not identical meaning. Similar, if not identical meaning. This is equal to your synonym. Right? Now supposing you use synonyms for this word communication. What are the various words that you can think of? You can think of the word share. Communicate. You communicate a message, you share a message. You can use the word talk. You can use the word express. If you talk, you will listen, isn't it? You can use a word, instead of I'll communicate to Y, you can say I, or my receiver, you can say I can write to my receiver. You can use the word discuss. You can use the word discuss. You can use the word network. See, it is not identical, but somewhat related. And many synonyms, right? So share, talk, express, write, discuss. These are various synonyms of the word communication. Now, when you look at these synonyms, share, talk, discuss, express, write. So when you write, you also read. When you talk, you also listen. So when you are using these synonyms of the word communication, what is obvious in these words along with the mother word communication? It becomes obvious that whether you are using the word communication or you're using the word, any of the synonyms of communication, you can try out with other synonyms also. You will realize that these functions or processes are not possible by one's own self. You cannot share anything with yourself. You need to share it with others. Right? So there has to be an other person to share, to talk to listen to discuss with, to express, to write to, and to read. You cannot do all these things by yourself. There has to be somebody else with whom you communicate, with whom you share, with whom you talk to or you listen to, with whom you discuss, with whom you express, with whom you write, and with whom you or whose writing you read. So the other person has to be present if communication or any of its synonymous functions are to happen. So this by itself proves that communication is indeed a two-way process, right? So this is something that we have established, and this two-way process, when you give something and you take back something, this two-way process is also called a transaction. Give and take, like you give money and you buy something. So communication basically is a transaction. You give something and you take back, and the two poles are between X and Y, where X is the sender and Y is the receiver. X gives a message and takes back a response from Y. That is why communication is a fundamental definition of communication, and this fundamental definition also becomes a fundamental principle that communication is and will always remain a two-way process. It will always remain a bipolar process. So we have this fundamental diagram that it is X who has a message for Y. X is the sender and Y is the receiver. So Y receives a message, understands it, and gives a feedback response, and this message has to go to Y. So this is the fundamental diagram of communication, and it explains that communication is a two-way process and that communication is a bipolar process. This has been established. Once this has been established, so now we realize this is the most fundamental definition of communication, that it's a two-way process, it's a bipolar process involving the sender X and receiver Y. This also then becomes a fundamental principle of communication, that communication is an exchange or a transaction of messages between X and Y, the sender and the receiver. The second point is, supposing you have X and you have a receiver Y. So this is a sender X and this is the receiver Y, and X sends a message. He sends a message to Y. Is this communication? Would you call this communication? X is giving a message. Like it always happens in a classroom, there is a teacher and say you have a student Y. Y is a student. Now the teacher teaches and gives some messages. Okay? What is a message? Like I'm teaching you, the content that I'm talking to you is my message to you. So will this be a communication? This is what is happening here. Is this communication? Ideally, this is not communication because there is no feedback coming back to the teacher. The teacher is speaking alone. This teacher was only giving. But we have realized that communication is a two-way process. So there has to be a response, isn't it? So without this response, we cannot believe that communication has happened. So what is then this figure where X, or the example that we have used, the teacher is giving a message to Y. What is this then? Well, this is, in a sense, a part of a very intrinsic, a very integral, that means very important part of, or an intrinsic part of the process of communication, this one way giving of the message. This one way giving of the message is called information dissemination. That means X as a sender has a message and X just gives the message to Y, the receiver. And X does not wait for a feedback. And this could happen for any number of reasons. X doesn't need Y's response. X cannot get Y's response. So we have two options. Y is not Y writing. Number one, X does not need this feedback. Or number two is not able to get a feedback. Okay? So does not need and is not able to are the two reasons primarily why this process does not have a feedback. And this process where Y does not give back a feedback is called information dissemination. Can you think of examples of information disseminations? Well, when you are in your organization, let's say you are in your schools and colleges and your university, this happens in abundance. Your notice board. This is one great example of information dissemination. The notice board, this is your notice board. It has notices. Y comes and sees it and goes back. Y does not really give a feedback to the writer of the notice. The writer of the notice could be your principal, your teacher, your head of the department, your vice chancellors. But as a student, you don't really say, okay sir, you just do what is expected to do. You take the message and you go. So this is often you must realize that part of the communication process where X is sending the message, this is the first part. This is called information dissemination. By itself, it is really not communication because communication will require a feedback. Now, when you're talking about notice boards, right, in your school and your colleges and your universities, you'll realize that the circulars, the notice board often becomes a process of communication. How? Why the students, they read the notice board, they read the circular and the instructions and they follow it. That following of the instructions in the notice board is the response X is looking at. They may say that Monday is a holiday. Monday, please don't come to college. Y reads it and does not report to college or school or the university on Monday. So Y is following the instruction on the notice board and in a sense Y gives. So this following is the feedback response. So notice board may also be looked upon as a communication where there is a feedback. Supposing it says Monday is a holiday but Tuesday is not a holiday. But the student Y does not read that Tuesday is not a holiday and takes both Monday off and a Tuesday off. Then the feedback, there is something wrong. So the communication was not really done well by X. Because here what you have to realize that good communication, the responsibility of good communication lies with the sender X. It is X's responsibility that X uses everything under his or her command to make Y understand his message. Now here you have to realize that the 7% and the 93% rule of the Mehrabian principle. That 7% through words and 93%. Now, if you were writing in the other previous, the point that I had just discussed was Monday was an off in the notice board, but Tuesday is not an off. Somehow the typing was such that students read Monday is a holiday and they did not read that Tuesday is working. And they assumed that Tuesday is an off. So there was something wrong in the way the notice was typed. The non-verbal element of the notice was not correct, and Y failed to read that Tuesday is not a holiday like Monday, and they assumed Tuesday to be a holiday. So it is X's responsibility to ensure that the communication is good and faultless. Now this is communication as a two-way process, and how communication is different from information dissemination. Information dissemination is one-way process where only the sender communicates. Can you give another example? Yes, you're right. The newspapers. One newspaper and so many receivers, Y1, Y2, Y3, Y infinite. So you have so many receivers receiving the same newspaper. Information dissemination, one example is newspapers. Similarly, think, and I'm sure you'll come across many other instances of information dissemination. So what we have discussed is, what is communication? The question what is communication can be answered and understood in various manners. Everybody can come up with a different answer. They can say communication is sharing, communication is an expression, communication is a human need, communication is a human capability and quality. Any definition, and believe me, they're all correct, because each one of us understand communication from our own point of view. But what is a universal agreement? Again, the word that I come across, I'd like to use is universal agreement. This universal agreement is communication is a two-way process, and communication is a bipolar process. And this, there is a give and take, there is a give and take, and this involves the X and Y. So whenever, till you have a receiver, you cannot communicate. The presence of Y is very important or indispensable for the process of communication to happen. Till there is a Y, there will be no communication. X could have a message, but until and unless X communicates the message to Y, there is no communication. So the universal agreement is, whether you call it sharing, whether you call it human need, whether you call it a human skill, whatever, the universal agreement is, it's a two-way process. It requires a receiver as much as it requires a sender, and that it's a similar meaning that derives from here is, it's a bipolar process. X and Y has to be present. Now when X and Y has to be present, the first part is information dissemination. Information dissemination means X has communicated a message and Y does not really give a response in the sense in terms of language, but maybe does some action. But apparently there is no feedback, and this is called information dissemination. Okay, so information dissemination is an integral part of communication. Without information dissemination, the process of communication cannot start. It is only the information has been disseminated that the sender Y receives it, then he understands it, he or she understands it and gives a feedback response. And once the feedback response comes back to X, the process of communication is said to be complete. So what starts with, this is the first step when X disseminates the information to Y, Y receives it, understands it and gives a feedback, and this concludes the two-way bipolar process, which is communication. Well, this is the first part of the series of videos that you're going to have on what is communication. We have just defined it, and I hope you've liked it.